Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris at Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our good friends Sam Clement and Courtney Trust. Y'all say hello.
How's it going?
Hey, John.
Hey, guys. This week, here we are at the beginning of March, and everyone's hoping spring's coming. The weather's been great here in central Alabama. Pollen's everywhere. Sam's eyes are watering, all that stuff. Spring is just around the corner. And yet, here we are, and all of a sudden, it seems as though the sabers are out between the United States and the Chinese, like maybe even worse than it was beforehand. The balloons caused panic, but here we are at the beginning of the week. President Xi Jinping was talking about how the United States and the West is trying to encircle China. And then I think, if I'm not mistaken, Tuesday perhaps, was it Qin Gang, who's the foreign secretary, came out and was blasting the United States saying, hey, listen here, you keep on pushing us, we're going to have confrontation. I got to tell you, that gets to be kind of scary stuff, and I don't know what you guys think of different generations and all that. Are you all worried about the Chinese and potentially getting into a real conflict with Beijing as opposed to just he said, she said, and throwing words around?
Yeah, and I think the Russian war going on right now has made it a bigger focal point because, obviously China has, been gobbling up a lot of the Russian oil and really kind of helping them out of a bind.
Sure.
And I think there had been a lot of hope on what China was going to do on pushing back on what Russia is doing in Ukraine with the war. They're the one party who could probably get Russia to kind of change their game plan a little bit, and it doesn't seem like that's been the case.
It doesn't seem like that's been the case at all. As a matter of fact, I've been reading some articles that now Beijing apparently is thinking about even extending some military aid and some drones and what have you to the Ruskies and see whether or not that could help turn the tide in terms of the Kremlin's favor. But, Courtney, you were the one who was talking about this just the other day, just taking a look at this. Why does it seem so much different now? It seems like Beijing and Washington have been trading barbs for a while, but now it seems a little bit more real.
I think just seeing the article and some of the terminology, and I guess that was my question to you all, is do you think some of it is fanfare where it's just, playing politics, making sure they're coming out strong in support of Russia and we're not going to, bow down to the United States and, we've done nothing wrong. It even seemed like they were kind of belittling us shooting down their espionage, whatever you want to call it. That was nothing. Why are you being so ridiculous about it? And to me, I worry, to your point about getting them, if they do get involved in the Russian and Ukraine conflict, what does that mean not only for Ukraine, but what does that mean for the world? At what point would the U.S. or other countries that have maybe aided Ukraine with military weapons, actually send troops? And that's what makes me really nervous.
That's kind of an all-encompassing question.
It is.
Statement.
Sorry,
Really
it's a big one.
That's more than just China. We're talking about World War III.
Yes.
That's what you're talking about, and whether or not maybe what Beijing's been saying is going to end up leading us there. And I can't get there yet. However, what does kind of keep me up at night is, I am not sure if the U.S. is really militarily capable of fighting two massive fronts. Like taking care of the Chinese in the Pacific and then having to go over and take care of the Russians if they wanted to over in Europe. And that's what gives me the greater concern. I think maybe one theater alone might be okay, but two theaters, I think we're going to have a real difficult time of it. And particularly, you mentioned Ukraine, and this is me speaking as an American and not necessarily the opinions of anyone else. It does frustrate me a little bit when I see the amount of aid the United States has given the Ukrainians compared to, really frankly, the remainder of Europe. Outside of maybe the Baltic states who have really given quite a bit relative to their GDP, it seems as though the United States is having to really kind of fit the bill for a lot of Western Europe. And Sam, I'm not sure what you're thinking about that.
It's an incredibly tight rope we're walking right now, because I do see...
It's not even a rope, I'd say it's a wire.
I very much see the importance of defending Ukraine right now, not necessarily, one, for Ukraine, but two, what this is kind of feeling like the early stages of for Russia, and what this would mean for, NATO in large part, and then at that point, then we're really having to step in a little bit more than we are for Ukraine, which is not a NATO country. But finding that tightrope or that tight wire when we're giving weapons, from a Russian perspective, probably feels like we're already in the war. And then if China starts delivering weapons in, it kind of feels like they're, actively taking a part in the war, not just purchasing oil on the black market. And what that looks like going forward, I think, is what scares me the most. And we've talked about before the buildup of the Chinese military, and it seems like that.
That's right.
While I don't believe it's anywhere close to the U.S.'s at this point in terms of technology, but they have been churning out ships, battleships, destroyers, aircraft carriers like no other. I mean, it's just unbelievable what they've been focusing on with their naval power.
And just the sheer manpower, like physical bodies. I mean, just based off their population, they could...
To me, I still very much believe in the technological supremacy of the U.S. military, or the Western militaries right now. The problem is manpower, ship power. I think wars are getting away from that a little bit in terms of how many numbers of people you have and battleships you have when there's unmanned drones that take off without a runway. So I think it's less important, but it is the focus that the Chinese military has put on, and the increasing confidence that I would say is in large part of that is what kind of scares me.
What about chemical warfare?
Oh, I'm not sure we'll get there with the Chinese or the Russians. I mean, that would be the last gasp of a small tyrant. I mean, that's a Kim Jong-un type of thing. I don't imagine Beijing would do that, and I don't think necessarily Russia would. I mean, it's always potential. There's always there, but during the Great War, the World War I think the global power saw just how awful that is, and that's I would say we probably even see tactical nukes before we start seeing wholesale chemical weapons.
I was going to say that I think nuclear weapons would be before that, but I think worth noting with nuclear weapons is the impact of those psychologically versus they are damaging, but we had weapons that could enact about the same amount of damage pre-nuclear weapons outside of the radiation side of it. So much of it was the psychological impact of it. And we're talking about nukes again, and these tactical nukes for bridges and things like that have apparently started to be used. And so I think just cautioning on that, people talk nuclear weapons in World War III.
Well, and I think too, what y'all have talked about is when you look at the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, I don't think a year ago we thought we would still be talking about it.
No.
And now it's like, okay, well, Ukraine has made such great strides, considering they were, like, by far the underdog, right?
Yeah.
And we know that Putin, like, will not walk away from this. No. Like, he's going to save face. So now China's involved. And so how does that up the game? Like, and I guess that's my struggle, is, like, when can this end? Like, where is the ending of this where... Putin can save face and it won't be any more. I mean, I know there's been plenty of casualties and all of that, which is awful, but, where can this end where it can actually, everyone can just walk away?
Courtney, I think we're now past that point. I mean, that's my personal take. I think we're past that point. It'd be impossible for Putin to save face without the annexation of the Donbass. I mean, that's just truthfully.
That's been a non-starter for Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's been a complete non-starter. And as long as, frankly, Kiev continues to get advanced weaponry primarily from the United States, and as long as Zelensky feels as though he's got backers in Washington, as long as they can fight toe to toe with the Russians, they really don't have a huge reason to step down. So I don't see this ending anytime soon. And who knows? I mean, as soon as I say that, maybe there'll be
good.
Let's
hope for that.
Week.
Yeah.
But
we're shipping off Abrams tanks, and Germany is shipping off Leopard tanks and training them. To me, the only way this ends is with Russia being a client state of China.
And that could happen, and the Chinese could eventually end up giving them a whole bunch of war material, and it just keeps on going and going. The thing is, Russia has, 3 or 4 times the number of manpower that the Ukrainians have. If all Russia wants to do is bleed Ukraine white, they could probably do it. So if this is just going to simply be a war of attrition. Who runs out of blood first, and who runs out of armaments first? And right now, with the United States supplying Ukraine seems to have a decent number of stockpiles. However, that begs the question: how much can the U.S. give and still be able to police the remainder of the world and be a deterrent in Asia if we're giving all this stuff to the Ukrainians? Sam, I mean, what is your thought on that?
I think we are able, I still very much believe, I've already said it, believe in the supremacy of the U.S. military. I think people have discounted that and talk about the number of nuclear arms that Russia has, and the nuclear arms that Russia has are largely outdated, and there's.
Well, you can make the same argument that a lot of ours are as well.
I think we're much further ahead than I think we maybe lead on to believe.
I would hope so. I mean, the thing is, that's the whole deal. I would say this, and going to be people that will be throwing their phones against the wall about what I'm about to say. I would hope so. That is what, as Americans, we've kind of been led to believe. However, it seems like with each mistake that we make, I have less faith in the supremacy of our technology. How does a 200-foot tall Chinese balloon find its way to the middle of the United States before anyone notices it?
Right.
How do we pull out of Afghanistan the way that we did? How do we let the number of fighting ships in our Navy get to a point where they are, and we have really no adequate way of getting to 355 ships in the near term? So I'm not maybe as convinced about the invulnerability of our military as we once were. And then kind of going back to what Courtney's first comments were, it's just when Chinese, with Qin Gang and what Xi said this week, is taking a step back and viewing it from Beijing's eyes. I don't necessarily think they're just being bellicose. I mean, if I'm Beijing, I'm sitting there looking at the United States getting together with the Indians, the Japanese, on the Australians to have a united front. Who's the united front against?
Right.
China. Well, I mean, that's obviously worrisome if I'm China. And the same thing with NATO to the Russians. Who is NATO? Who is NATO supposed to be against?
Right.
Russia. So I mean, I understand why these countries, while we consider them pariahs, if I'm living in those countries, if I'm running those governments, I can understand why they would be upset with the position that Washington and the remainder of the world, or the remainder of the Western world, has taken.
Yeah, I just think the economic toll that is being placed on Russia, and that's just from even an outside perspective with the data that we're seeing, which has, just all kinds of caveats with it about the accuracy of it. But the inflation rate and the weakening of their economy is something that I think ends up leading it more towards being a client state, and what that looks like as the way to kind of wrap it up at some point. And there's been talks of Putin's health issues, whatever that looks like. But I just think the weakening, there comes a point where the economic pain in Russia would be too much to bear.
Well, and in the article that we referenced earlier, John, they were talking about how the United States had banned, I think it was certain ships coming from China that we didn't feel comfortable having in our technology. And, there's been talk about banning TikTok, which is a Chinese, and obviously they think that that's ridiculous, right, from the Chinese point of view. But when you do look at how dependent we are on China, if we were to be involved in military conflict, even if it wasn't directly with them, how would that affect our economy? And already in a time in which inflation, everything's costing us more, and then potentially you take China out of it. Take the war stuff out, that's also going to hurt.
There would have to be pretty severe economic pain that we'd have to be able to stomach to separate ourselves from China.
It's not just even direct economic ties with China. It's the indirect ties as well.
Right.
And, you see this with wholesalers and companies around the world. Hey, I'm going to cut my ties with China, so I'm moving production to Vietnam.
But they're outsourcing to China.
which the suppliers in Vietnam and Indonesia and elsewhere are getting a bunch of their inputs from China. So it's the globalization of the economy has made it such where it'd be impossible to completely get away from China. But at the same time, we do need to start taking this stuff a little bit more seriously than I think we have. And I'm not a protectionist. I'm not saying that's where we should be going. But at least in our armaments industry, we really need to think about how we source this stuff.
And I think there needs to be a bigger focus on the USMCA and just the North American countries. There's talks of labor getting cheaper, if not as cheap in China now as it is in Mexico, which has its own issues that we've definitely seen pop up, especially this week. There starts to be a bigger focus on that from our federal government and how we can leverage that, a trading partner, if Mexico can clean itself up a little bit with the,
And that's
the
a huge
cartels.
if. That's a huge if.
It is a huge if, but think of the leverage with that. A country that can produce goods just as cheap, that you don't have to worry about as much of the supply chain. If if that big if was ever kind of satisfied.
No. Now, Courtney, I mean, having that, bushel full of children.
Yes.
I mean, just so many of them. And there's all this uncertainty that's in the world right now. Does any of this give you kind of pause? Like, what in the world is it going to be like over the next 10, 15 years as your elder boys get to be a point where they could actually go, suit up?
Oh, I know. No, it gives me a ton of anxiety as I am a worry wart.
Are you? Are you worried?
Yeah, I know. You don't know that? No, I mean, it's like, don't worry about things that are, it's like what Scarlett O'Hara,
What?
the saying, I'll worry about that another day or whatever.
Right.
Anyways,
Tomorrow's another day.
tomorrow's another day. The biggest is my oldest son asked me, I think it was yesterday or the day before, he said, Mom, are we still in that, is Russia still fighting Ukraine? And I said, yes. And he was like, well, why don't we just go in there and like end it? And I said, well, I was like, do you remember?
Who's we?
He means the United
I
States.
think he means him.
He means Sam.
Oh, well, no, yeah, no, he is not.
Why doesn't Mr. Clement just go over
Yeah,
and end the
and
war?
I said, well, I was like, and so I kind of realized, I was like, well, we don't want to start another like world war where you have multiple superpowers. And I said, you remember, like, we talked about Vietnam. I was like, and we basically didn't do anything in Vietnam other than have a lot of casualties, from my recollection, which is not necessarily.
They didn't teach the Vietnam War in history class when I was coming along. You know why?
Because it was happening then.
Kind of set yourself up. For that.
Yeah, he did.
It wasn't really history. So,
Right. Yeah. So that was what you were gonna say.
It wasn't necessarily happening. I mean, I think the tanks went through the presidential palace in Saigon in 1975, and I do remember that. But I was, 7 at the time, 7.
Right, and I mean, even when you look at, to your point that you've already talked about, like the war in Iraq, and the Middle East, like it has jaded my generation even of thinking, is there such thing as like a beginning and an ending of a war? Like, does it really truly ever end? And what is the benefit of losing, thousands of lives? I mean, is it worth it?
Well, and I think part of the problem too is when wars get less quantifiable on winners and losers, with it not being a pure body count. And even Vietnam, I mean, if you looked at the body count, we won significantly, but then you look at everybody's reactions and feelings towards it, like you just said, didn't really win or accomplish a whole lot. And as wars get less reliant on human blood being shed, they can last a lot longer.
You could make a pretty clear argument that it's hard to say that we've truly been a definitive winner, and really
Since World War II.
Since World War II. Maybe Korea, I don't know, maybe. But in Vietnam, yeah, I mean, we killed a lot more of the Viet Cong and the NVAs than the other way around. However, they're still there. We're here.
Right.
We didn't really put up anything like the French. I mean, the French still. You go to South Vietnam. I mean, you still have buildings that the French put up. They eat banh mi on baguettes. Very little to show that we were there. And the same thing, like in the Middle East and Iraq and all that stuff. That's still a mess. It's still uncertain. So, I don't blame you for being concerned about this, Sam. I don't blame you for being concerned about it. And I've got a son who's 21 years of age. That's kind of like. I'm anxious about this. Just I don't want to see John go off and fight in a war or potentially be killed when I don't understand what success looks like.
Right.
Yeah.
What's the end game? Especially if China is going to be involved, that changes it.
It's kind of like so. What does success look like? We just don't want the Chinese and the Spratly Islands. Okay. So what if they take the Spratly Islands? How's that impact me?
Right.
I mean, how does it really impact anyone? I mean, we can make some arguments, oil in the Philippines and Taiwan and all that stuff. And is that enough to send my child to go die?
The tough thing is the conversation around a domino effect.
Yeah.
And that's the same conversation around Ukraine and why I think
we
it's
had
important.
the same conversation back in the 60s about the domino effect.
Right. And that's always going to be, at what point do you draw the line? Because there's going to have to be a point you draw the line.
Yeah.
Whether that's China taking Taiwan? Do they inch closer to Hawaii? I mean, obviously we wouldn't let them take Hawaii.
Well,
I'm just thinking
they would get to Guam first, I
right.
think.
So you take at what point do we say enough is enough?
Right. And
There
at that
has to
point,
be
is
some
that
point.
too late? Like,
Yeah,
have they
right.
done so much that we have said, okay, that's okay for them to do this, and they do this, all right, I guess we'll allow that.
And
then,
I think that's also part of the issue, being the world superpower and the reserve currency and just all that kind of stuff that makes it a harder question to answer with a short answer. It's just
Well,
really
I mean,
complicated.
it kind of goes back to sort of what success looks like, and I don't think the three of us know.
No, I'm
what
not
does
sure
success
anyone
look like?
really knows.
And,
And I think that's part of
for
the
them
issue.
to just stop
And
fighting.
that is part of the issue, and that because no one really knows what success looks like, I would say, kind of going full circle, Courtney. That's the reason why you have the Chinese Foreign Minister Chen saying what he said on Tuesday. That's why you have Xi Jinping saying what he said over the weekend or on Monday. They don't know exactly what our definition of success feels like. It looks like, so they feel a little bit freer, kind of poking the bear a little bit. And
Yeah.
the same thing with the Russians. They don't know what our end game is in Western Europe, so why not take some chances? And the same thing with the Chinese. And that's one of those deals. That's kind of one of the drawbacks of American politics, and the fact that our foreign policy potentially changes every 4 years.
Yeah, 2 years even at that, and it's kind of like the joke that you have to cross the line to know where it is.
Yeah, and so that's where the Chinese and the Russians have a little bit of a head start or hand up or whatnot, in the fact that they're playing for decades.
Yeah.
And we're playing for
Dynasties.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
Especially in China.
We're playing for political cycles.
Yep.
That's kind of a downer.
Yeah.
That's
It is a
kind of a
downer.
downer topic. Thank you, Courtney, for wanting
You're
to talk
welcome.
about this today. We kind of took it down a dark slope, but guys, I mean, this is something that we like to have fun here at Trading Perspectives, and we kind of laugh a lot, but at the same time, there are some real important stuff going on in the world, and some real kind of disturbing stuff if you really take it down to the illogical conclusion on some of this stuff. But in any event, we always love to hear from you all. So if you have any comments or questions, please, by all means, let us know. You can always drop us a line at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, where you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. As always, if you're interested in reading more, hearing more of what we have to say or how we think, you can always go to oakworth.com and take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab for all kinds of exciting information. With that, Courtney, Sam, giving you all last chance to have another comment on this interesting topic.
That's all I got.
That's it, John.
That's all I've got to do, too. Y'all take care.